My son said, "You look like a beggar, Dad." He laughed loud and careless in front of my guests. I felt a heat rise in my chest for a split second, but I didn't respond. Not a word. Not a flicker of anger. The guests shifted uncomfortably, some glancing between us, some trying to suppress polite laughter, none daring to intervene. He strutted around the living room, picking up the glasses, tossing napkins, acting like he owned the place. The arrogance in his eyes, the cocky smile, the casual cruelty, it was unbearable to witness. I sipped my drink, letting the silence stretch, letting him feel the weight of the moment, without me uttering a single sound. Years of entitlement had made him forget the world doesn't revolve around him. He leaned back on the sofa, arms crossed, laughing about something trivial, but every laugh felt like a tiny blade. I reminded myself to stay calm, to hold the quiet that would speak louder than any words I could muster. After a while, he strutted past me again, knocking over a decorative vase. It shattered. The guests winced, but I didn't flinch. I poured another glass of water, sat down slowly, and let him think he had conquered the room. That night, I went to my office. The room was quiet, lit only by the soft glow of my desk lamp. I opened the old company account. He had no idea it existed. No idea I had maintained it all these years. I typed a few numbers, checked the balances, verified accounts, and made silent adjustments. No dramatic gestures, no notifications, no confrontations. Just a quiet, precise orchestration of what was already mine. The next morning, he strutted into the kitchen, shirt untucked, hair messy from sleep, grinning, already assuming he was the star of the household. I watched him calmly as he reached for his phone. The first notification made him stop. He read it once, then again, frowning. Transaction failed. Insufficient funds, his grin faltered. Confusion spread across his face. He rushed to check his other accounts, fingers trembling, eyes widening with disbelief. I stayed seated, calm as ever. The arrogance, the superiority, the laughter, all gone, replaced with the hollow echo of shock, the kind that comes when reality hits harder than anyone else ever could. He ran to his computer, checking emails, messages, and notifications. Each one confirmed the same truth. The paycheck he had been flaunting, the balance he had been boasting about was under my control, every penny, every account, every line of credit he had thought was his own. All part of the empire I had quietly maintained. I thought about all the mornings I had woken early to make sure he had breakfast, all the nights I stayed up paying bills, all the times I had driven him to school, helped him with homework, supported him when he stumbled, and all those years unnoticed, unacknowledged, taken for granted. Now, for the first time, he was realizing the truth. The hands he had mocked, the man he had belittled, were the same hands that held the keys to his world. The guests murmured softly, glancing between us. Some tried to hide their amusement, some looked shocked, but none could speak. He dropped to the couch, head in his hands. His chest rose and fell rapidly. Sweat beaded his forehead. The first taste of humility he had ever known. I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice. I simply leaned back, sipping my coffee. The quiet had become my loudest weapon. The invisible power I had maintained all these years was finally revealed. Minutes passed. His panic escalated. He scrolled through accounts, muttering under his breath, realizing every paycheck, every bonus, every financial brag was nothing without me. He had mocked my clothes, my old car, my modest lifestyle. He had assumed I was weak, dependent, irrelevant. Now, in a heartbeat, he understood just how wrong he had been. I remembered the mornings he had sat at this same kitchen table, complaining about school, about chores, about life itself. I had listened patiently, never expecting him to appreciate the sacrifices, and yet now he was forced to learn the consequences. The room grew silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the wall clock. Time had slowed for him, but for me it was the moment I had been waiting for. Justice without cruelty, lesson without malice, revelation without a shout. He looked up finally, eyes wide, trembling. I don't understand, he stammered. His voice was tight, faltering, broken for the first time in his life. I smiled faintly, the calmest I had ever felt in years. This is reality, I said softly. Sometimes what you think is yours isn't, and sometimes what you mock is what carries you. He sank back onto the couch, utterly defeated. The laughter, the arrogance, the sense of entitlement, all vanished. His world, which had seemed so secure, collapsed in the quietest way imaginable. I took another sip of my coffee. The day went on. I spoke with my guests, offered tea, laughed politely, all while he sat there, realizing for the first time that I had always been more than he had ever imagined. By evening, he hadn't left the couch. He didn't argue. He didn't challenge. He just sat there absorbing the lesson he could never unlearn. And I was finally free of the humiliation, the arrogance and the ignorance that had been directed at me for so long. Arrogance dies quietly, but its echoes are deafening. And today he felt them all. The next morning the house felt unusually quiet. He didn't speak at breakfast, just sat staring at his plate, poking at his food without really tasting it. The arrogance and confidence he had carried the day before had evaporated, leaving only confusion, panic, and a growing sense of dread. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the steam rising slowly, mingling with the morning sunlight that spilled across the kitchen table. I sipped deliberately, letting the warmth settle in, letting the calmness I carried contrast sharply with his inner turmoil. He fidgeted in his seat, glancing around nervously, trying to gauge if anyone else noticed his distress. I didn't intervene. I let him sit with it, letting the consequences of his own arrogance take root in his mind. Minutes stretched into hours. He checked his phone repeatedly, his brow furrowed deeper with each glance. Each notification, each message, each email brought only more confusion. His bank accounts, his credit cards, the paycheck he had been flaunting, they were all inaccessible. Every transaction bounced, every transfer failed. He got up and paced the room. His movements were frantic, desperate, the kind of restlessness that comes when someone realizes their world has shifted beneath their feet. He muttered under his breath, trying to rationalize, trying to make excuses, but the truth was undeniable. He had been blind, arrogant, and dismissive for years, and now he was paying the price. The guests from yesterday had gone, but the echo of his arrogance lingered. I didn't feel anger or vindictiveness. I simply felt the quiet satisfaction of watching life restore balance on its own. He grabbed his laptop, fingers trembling, eyes wide. The first attempt to log into his accounts failed. The second attempt revealed the same reality. Every financial move he had relied on, every source of income he had assumed was steady, was controlled by me, his father, all along. I remembered the years he had mocked my clothes, my old car, my modest lifestyle. He had scoffed at my decisions, laughed at my caution, and belittled the quiet life I had built with patience and care. Now, his arrogance was crumbling in front of him. The man who had thought he could belittle me was powerless. The tables had turned in the quietest, most irreversible way possible. He called his friends, hoping for help, hoping for guidance, hoping for a lifeline. But no one answered. His texts went unread. Even the people he thought he could rely on were gone, leaving him stranded, facing the full consequences of his assumptions. I moved through the house, quietly, calmly, sipping my coffee, observing the scene unfold without interference. Every sigh, every muttered curse, every panicked glance reflected back the arrogance he had carried just yesterday. It was humbling, poetic, and completely self-earned. By afternoon, he had discovered another layer of the consequences. Emails from creditors, notifications from financial institutions, alerts about failed payments. They all arrived in rapid succession. His eyes widened with disbelief. His hands shook as he scrolled through each message, each one driving the lesson deeper. He had prided himself on his independence, his success, his self-assurance. Now he realized that none of it was truly his. It had been built on the foundation I had quietly maintained, the work I had done while he had been laughing, mocking, and dismissive. The tension in the air was thick, almost tangible. I could hear him muttering to himself, trying to grasp the full weight of the mistake he had made. But words could not undo the lesson. Action, patience, and the quiet power I wielded had already set it in motion. I walked past the living room again, my presence calm, grounded, almost meditative. He looked up for a moment, eyes wide with panic and disbelief, but I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The world had already spoken for me. The sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the room. Even as the golden light painted the walls, he remained restless, pacing, muttering, panicking, a stark contrast to the serenity I carried inside me. By evening, he had finally slumped onto the couch exhausted. His pride, arrogance, and sense of superiority had been completely stripped away. He sat with his head in his hands, trying to process the collapse of the life he had assumed was secure. I poured another cup of coffee and sat quietly in the study, watching him, feeling a sense of satisfaction that went far beyond revenge. It wasn't anger that drove me. It was balance, justice, and the quiet fulfillment of a lesson delivered perfectly. Hours passed. Night fell. The house was calm except for the occasional mutter from him as he tried to rationalize. But the lesson was already imprinted in his mind. He realized, finally, that life is not about appearances, not about mocking those who build quietly behind the scenes, and not about arrogance or entitlement. It's about understanding, respect, patience, and recognizing that the ones you underestimate are often the most powerful. By midnight, he was still awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out how everything had collapsed so quickly. I sat in my study, a soft lamp casting light across the room, my hands calm, my mind clear, my heart steady. I had been patient. I had waited, and the lesson had arrived exactly as it should. No shouting, no confrontation, no visible revenge, just the silent, unstoppable force of consequence. And I knew as I sipped my coffee that this day would be remembered by him forever. The day he learned that life is earned, not flaunted. The day he realized that the man he had mocked was quietly in control all along, and this was only the beginning. By the third day, the silence in the house had become almost suffocating. My son barely spoke, barely moved, barely breathed the same air as before. Every glance he cast my way was cautious, almost fearful, as if the invisible chains of his arrogance had finally tightened around him. He had called every friend he thought he could rely on. Some ignored him. Some offered empty words of encouragement that didn't help, and all of them reminded him of the reality he had tried so hard to avoid. He was powerless. I watched from the kitchen, making myself a cup of tea, the morning sunlight streaming across the polished counters. The calm I felt was profound, almost sacred. The chaos in his mind was the exact counterbalance to the patience and quiet control I had maintained for decades. He attempted to check his accounts again. His laptop pinged and chimed with alerts, messages, and failed transactions. Each one a hammer striking down the fragile illusion of security he had built around himself. I remembered the way he had mocked my old shoes, my worn watch, the casual slouch of my posture, the quiet dignity I carried in my movements. He had laughed at every detail, thinking it reflected weakness. Now he understood the truth. Strength is not always visible, and power is not always loud. By mid-morning, he was pacing frantically, shouting into his phone, his voice cracking, the first real taste of desperation in his life. The friends he had once counted on as pillars of support were nowhere to be found, and the arrogance that had carried him through social gatherings, parties, and office meetings had evaporated into thin air. I sipped my tea again, letting him experience the full weight of this lesson, letting the silence stretch and hum with the echoes of his pride crashing down. At one point, he collapsed onto the sofa, head in hands, and let out a long, tremulous sigh. He had realized that all his achievements, all his boasts, were temporary constructs built on foundations he had never understood. The irony was not lost on me. The very same hands he had ridiculed, mocked, and underestimated had built the empire he had relied on without realizing it. Every paycheck he had bragged about, every financial triumph he had flaunted, had quietly been under my watchful control. He tried to reach out to his co-workers, sending desperate emails and frantic messages, but no one responded in time to save him from the cascading consequences. The more he tried, the faster the truth unfolded, and the deeper his humiliation sank in. By afternoon, he was visibly broken. His posture slumped, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock. Even his friends who had finally returned calls could offer no relief. The system had caught up to him. Every layer of arrogance, entitlement, and mockery had been stripped away. I walked past him casually, the sun casting warm light on the hardwood floor. He looked up briefly, eyes wide, searching for a way out, any escape from the reality he had created for himself. I said nothing. I didn't need to. He could feel it in the air, the quiet dominance, the invisible control, the patience that had quietly orchestrated his downfall. By evening, he had retreated to his room, still shaking, still scrolling through failed notifications, still trying to comprehend how everything he had counted on could vanish without a single warning. I sat in my study, reviewing documents, sipping my coffee, and felt a profound sense of justice, not of cruelty but of balance. The arrogance that had permeated our household had finally met its match. Night fell. He wandered the house restless, pacing like a caged animal. Every corner he turned reminded him of the life he had once taken for granted, the quiet stability I had built, the patience I had exercised, the strength he had never acknowledged. I finally called him into the living room. He approached hesitantly, shoulders slumped, eyes downcast, the cocky, careless demeanor of the past completely gone. "Dad, he began, but the words faltered, trailing off into silence. I didn't answer. I simply motioned for him to sit. The lesson had already been delivered. No words could add to its weight. He sat defeated, silent. I poured him a glass of water, and he accepted it without a word. The arrogance, the laughter, the mockery, all gone. By midnight, the house was quiet except for the soft hum of electronics and the occasional creak of the floorboards. He sat alone, staring at the ceiling, absorbing the reality of his actions, and I, sitting calmly in my study, felt the satisfaction of justice delivered without confrontation, without anger, just patience, strategy, and quiet authority. The lesson was complete. He had learned that life is not about appearances. It is not about mockery or entitlement. It is about respect, understanding, and acknowledging the quiet power that often goes unseen. I looked out the window at the stars, my hands resting on the edge of the table, and I knew that tomorrow, his world would be even smaller, his humility deeper, and the consequences of his arrogance permanent. He had finally begun to understand that I had always been in control, not through shouting, not through force, not through visible displays, but through patience, wisdom, and the quiet authority of a life well lived. And that understanding, once realized, would change him forever. By the fourth day, the house felt like a different world. The energy that had once been filled with laughter, casual arrogance, and careless confidence had shifted entirely. My son moved like a man who had lost his bearings, every step tentative, every glance anxious, every breath measured. He hadn't left his room since morning, his phone buzzing incessantly with reminders of failed payments, bounced checks, and emails from creditors. Each notification was like a hammer, striking down the fragile illusion of control he had always assumed was his. I moved through the house calmly, sipping my coffee, observing the chaos unfold without interference. The quiet strength I carried contrasted sharply with his frantic energy. I let him experience every second of the lesson, letting the consequences wash over him fully, without a word from me. He finally emerged in the afternoon, eyes wide, hair disheveled, clothes wrinkled, still trying to grasp the enormity of the collapse around him. His friends had been unable to bail him out, their casual promises empty against the reality of what had been orchestrated quietly by me. I watched him pace the living room, hands trembling, muttering under his breath, the arrogance that had once filled the room, now replaced with sheer desperation. He glanced at the furniture, the walls, the polished floors. All the things he had mocked, all the stability he had assumed was beneath him, and realized the power I had always held silently. He tried calling his colleagues again, pleading for guidance, for support, for a miracle, but the calls went unanswered. Every attempt to regain control only reminded him of the truth. He was powerless without the foundation he had once taken for granted. I moved quietly into the study, opening old ledgers, checking accounts, making minor adjustments here and there, not to hurt him further but to reinforce the lesson. He had assumed he understood the world, but he had only understood the surface, never the depths of responsibility, patience, and control that true power requires. By evening, his exhaustion was evident. He slumped onto the sofa, staring blankly at the floor, his pride and arrogance completely eroded. His phone lit up again and again with failed notifications, each one a mirror of his own past mistakes. The irony was palpable. The same hands he had mocked, the same man he had ridiculed, had quietly held the keys to everything he had valued. Everything he had assumed was independent of me. I didn't gloat. I didn't shout. I simply observed. The lesson was stronger when delivered without words, without drama, without the satisfaction of cruelty. He eventually wandered into the kitchen, looking for something, anything, to regain a sense of normalcy. I poured myself a cup of tea, then offered him one. He accepted silently, a gesture of humility he had never made before. Hours passed. He attempted to make sense of his finances, tried to call the banks directly, but every attempt failed. Every email, every message, every transaction reminded him that his independence had been an illusion. I reflected quietly on the years I had spent building my life, the sacrifices I had made, the patience I had exercised, the quiet endurance that had allowed me to maintain control while he had been blind to it. By late evening, he had returned to his room, sitting on the edge of his bed, head in hands, the weight of reality finally pressing down. He was exhausted, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. I walked past silently, observing without judgment, without intervention, letting him experience the full scope of the lesson. The arrogance that had once defined him had been stripped away completely, and still there was more to come. Tomorrow he would face another layer of consequences, more reminders that the man he had mocked, the father he had underestimated, was the same man who had quietly held his life in his hands all along. I sipped my tea slowly, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the room in deep golden shadows. I had waited patiently for this moment, and now justice, balance, and the quiet authority of a life well lived were unfolding exactly as they should. By midnight, the house was silent except for the soft hum of appliances. He sat awake in his room, scrolling through notifications. Every failed transaction, every bounced message a testament to the lesson he had earned. I leaned back in my chair, allowing the calm, quiet strength I had cultivated over decades to contrast perfectly with the panic, fear, and desperation that now consumed him. And I knew the collapse he was experiencing wasn't temporary. The arrogance of youth, the mockery, the entitlement, it had been replaced permanently by humility, respect, and the awareness of true power. Tomorrow, the consequences would deepen further. But tonight the lesson had taken root, and I finally felt the peace that comes when patience, wisdom, and restraint deliver justice without a single raised hand. By the fifth day, the house had transformed into a stage for quiet reckoning. My son moved like a shadow of his former self, every step hesitant, every glance anxious, every breath measured. The confidence and arrogance he had worn like armor were gone, replaced by the weight of reality pressing down with relentless force. He had spent the entire morning staring at his failed accounts, trying to call friends, colleagues, and even his bank, but no one could help him. The false security he had clung to for years had evaporated. Every resource he had assumed was his was now nothing more than a mirage. I moved through the house calmly, sipping my coffee, observing the unraveling with a quiet patience. The silence of the house was almost deafening, broken only by the soft buzz of his phone and the occasional frustrated mutter from him. He attempted to log into another account, only to be met with repeated failures. Each alert, each bounced payment, each declined transaction hammered the reality deeper into his mind. He was powerless. I remembered every morning I had woken early to prepare his breakfast. Every night I had stayed up paying bills. Every sacrifice I had silently made while he mocked my modest lifestyle, my old car, my quiet demeanor. Now he was paying the price for years of ignorance, arrogance, and entitlement. The lessons he had refused to learn as a child were unfolding with brutal clarity. By midday his panic had escalated. He called everyone he thought he could trust, his voice cracking with desperation. The answers were always the same: nothing could be done. The banks confirmed failed transactions. Colleagues confirmed missed deadlines. Friends had vanished. He flopped onto the sofa, exhausted, head in hands, muttering incoherently. I walked past silently, letting him experience the full weight of the consequences. The arrogance he had displayed the day he called me a beggar had been replaced with the harsh reality of humility and accountability. Hours passed. He tried to piece together what had happened, scouring his accounts, rereading emails, but each attempt only confirmed the truth. He had underestimated me, his father, the quiet man he had mocked for years, and now he was finally understanding just how wrong he had been. The evening arrived, painting the house in warm golden light. He slumped into the armchair by the window, staring out at the street as if it held some hidden solution to his predicament. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat across the room, calm and serene. He tried to speak again, words stumbling out in a rush of desperation. "Dad, I don't understand." His voice faltered, lost in the weight of his failure. I said nothing. There was no need. The lesson was already embedded in every tremor, every bead of sweat, every frantic glance at his phone. By nightfall, he had reached the deepest point of his panic. His friends had abandoned him. His colleagues had no answers. Every attempt to regain control failed. The empire he had assumed was his had quietly been under my guidance all along. I walked past his room, observing him sitting on the edge of his bed, hands trembling, eyes wide, realizing that he had taken for granted the very foundation I had built. The realization was crushing, irreversible. The arrogance of youth had collided violently with the patience and quiet authority of experience. I reflected on the years of preparation, sacrifice and endurance that had quietly built the life he had mocked. Every laugh he had thrown at me, every scoff, every belittling comment, had been meaningless against the quiet power I had maintained. By midnight, he was still awake, restless, haunted by the collapse of his world. The house was silent, except for the soft hum of electronics, the ticking clock and his own shallow breaths. I sat in my study, sipping tea, letting the gravity of the situation sink in. He had learned the most important lesson of his life. Life is not about appearances, mockery, or entitlement. It's about patience, understanding, respect, and recognizing the quiet power that sustains what you take for granted. And he had finally learned it, not through lecture, not through confrontation, but through the unyielding, invisible authority of someone who had quietly shaped his world all along. I finally leaned back, breathing deeply. The house was calm, the lesson complete. The arrogance of youth humbled permanently, and for the first time in days, I felt a peace that comes from justice delivered without a single raised voice. By the sixth day, the house was cloaked in a heavy silence. Even the walls seemed to carry the weight of what had transpired over the past days. My son moved like a man trapped in his own failure, every step hesitant, every glance fearful, every breath shallow and uneven. He hadn't slept properly. He hadn't eaten properly. Every attempt to regain control of his finances, his reputation, his sense of superiority had failed. The arrogance that had once defined him was now replaced with panic, shame, and the raw humiliation of reality. I moved through the house as though it were a sanctuary, calm, measured, deliberate. Each sip of coffee, each quiet step, each glance at the documents on my desk was a silent reminder that control had always been mine. He had mocked me, ridiculed me, belittled me, but he had never understood that real power is invisible, patient, strategic, and unyielding. He tried again to call his friends. He tried to reach out to colleagues. He tried to contact anyone who might help him salvage what he thought was his life. But every call went unanswered. Every message remained unread. Every attempt ended in frustration, panic, and despair. By late morning, he had resorted to pacing, muttering under his breath, checking notifications, reading failed transactions over and over. His hands trembling, sweat beading on his forehead, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he tried to absorb the enormity of the collapse. I watched him silently from the kitchen, sipping tea, the morning sunlight streaming across the counters. The quiet authority I had cultivated over decades was now fully on display without a single word or gesture. He had mocked my old clothes, my modest car, my quiet patience. He had assumed that because I did not flaunt wealth or status, I lacked power or influence. Now in the harshest of ways, he was learning the truth. By afternoon, the consequences had deepened. The banks had frozen some accounts. The transactions he relied upon were reversed. Even small creditors called him with urgency, reminding him of obligations he could no longer meet. He fell to his knees in the living room, hands gripping the edge of the sofa, head bowed, chest heaving, eyes wide with panic. He had never felt anything like this. The arrogance, the confidence, the pride, gone, vanished into thin air. I finally entered the room calmly, deliberately. He looked up, trembling, barely recognizing the man before him as his father. Not because I had changed, but because he finally saw me for who I truly was. "Dad, please, he began, voice shaking, but the words faltered, swallowed by the weight of reality. I said nothing. There was no need. The lesson was complete, embedded in every trembling muscle, Every frantic glance at his failed finances, every sense of powerlessness. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floors. I walked past him, hands in pockets, calm, unyielding, allowing him to sit in the quiet devastation of his arrogance. No words could enhance the lesson. No gestures could make it clearer. He looked around, finally noticing the details he had once mocked. The neat furniture, the polished counters, the subtle touches of order in every room. It was all built by me, maintained by me, controlled by me. And for the first time he realized that his life, his money, his sense of superiority, had never truly been in his hands. Hours passed. He tried to make sense of it, tried to rationalize, tried to beg for forgiveness, but the reality was irreversible. By evening, the full weight of understanding had settled on him. He sat on the edge of the sofa, head bowed, shaking. The first real taste of humility he had ever experienced. I finally broke the silence. Not to lecture, not to yell, but to let the lesson resonate. Some things you take for granted, I said softly, are built quietly, patiently by those you belittle. And mocking them doesn't diminish their power, it only blinds you to it. He looked up at me, eyes wide, tears brimming. I never realized, he whispered, voice barely audible. I nodded, not with approval, but with acknowledgement. The lesson had been learned. The arrogance, the entitlement, the laughter, all replaced by shock, humility, and understanding. Night fell. The house was silent, except for the hum of electronics, the occasional creak of the floorboards, and his quiet sobs in the corner. I walked past him one last time that evening, sipping my tea, and felt a sense of calm that came only from decades of patience, endurance, and quiet authority. I had waited for this moment. I had allowed the lesson to unfold naturally, strategically, and irrevocably. By midnight he was finally still, exhausted, broken, humbled. He understood for the first time the true meaning of power, respect, and responsibility. And I knew as I sat in my study that nothing in the world could undo what had happened. The arrogance had been crushed, the entitlement stripped away. The lesson had been delivered perfectly, silently, invisibly, irreversibly. He would never mock me again. He would never underestimate me. And he would carry the weight of this realization for the rest of his life. I took a final sip of tea, leaned back and smiled faintly. The quiet had won. Patience had won. The truth had won. And that, I thought, is how power, respect, and justice are truly maintained. Not with noise, not with anger, not with confrontation, but with calm, measured patience and unwavering control over one's own life and theirs.